Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Empty Cloud. We're going to be here for another Dhamma discussion. So my name is Ayya Vaḍḍha. I'm a resident monastic here at Empty Cloud Monastery. And today we're going to be talking about Samatha-Vipassanā, which we talked a little bit about a couple weeks ago. So before we get started with the talk, I'll just say hello to Sukeshani, hello, Geeta, Edward, welcome. And I'll start with three Namo Tassas to pay homage to the Buddha, our original teacher, and then we can go ahead and get started. And anybody, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the chat during the talk. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So I thought that today we could do a little bit of a sutta tour, kind of a guided, a tour through some of the discussions in the suttas. So these are the Buddhist discourses on Samatha and Vipassana. So this talk will be a little bit more in depth, a little bit more detail. So if you're not familiar with the essentials of Buddhism, it might be mildly confusing, but we'll try to keep it pretty straightforward. And so I thought I'd maybe start by saying a little bit about the title. So cultivating the mind ground, Samatha-Vipassanā. To kind of get us started here, the reason that I titled the talk this is because a lot of times when we think about meditation, we think about very specific activities or techniques, seated, etc. Whereas when the Buddha talked about meditation, he was using words like cultivation or bringing certain qualities of mind into our mind ground, we could say. So our mind ground is our experience of the world, our experience within our own mind, right? Kind of the karmic seeds and fruits that kind of ripen and give us our different experiences in which we react to. So we're kind of living in this garden, this mind ground, and we're constantly reacting or acting or planting or weeding this garden, which is our experience of reality. And so the Buddha, when he talked about the path, the Noble Eightfold Path, he was talking about a means of cultivation, a means of gradually leading us onward to cultivate this mind ground. And so that's kind of the context for when we talk about Samatha-Vipassanā, is we should have a broader view of these terms and of these qualities that we're developing and the different means that we use to develop these qualities. We're trying to do that constantly, right? So if we only do it when we're seated and we close our eyes, then elsewhere, when we're out about doing other postures and other activities, if we contradict the qualities of Dhamma that we cultivate, then when we're seated, it's going to essentially be an activity of mostly undoing all of the unwholesome qualities that we've been cultivating. And all the seeds of that unwholesome, you could say the fruits of that unwholesome action will be ripening in our mind, right? So if we tend to get angry, if we tend to go after sense pleasures and things like that, then when we sit to meditate, all the fruits of those seeds we've been planting into our mind will start to spring up, and we'll essentially just have to deal with managing the unwholesome activity that we've done elsewhere. So when we sit down and we cultivate Samatha-Vipassanā, it should really be a continuation. We never leave this mind ground. We never leave this experience of mind that we're constantly cultivating until we eventually let go. And so what does the Buddha actually have to say about cultivating Samatha-Vipassanā? Well, the Buddha says, a mendicant should reflect, have I cultivated serenity and discernment? Suppose that upon checking, they know that they haven't cultivated them. They should make an effort to do so. So last time in our talk a couple weeks ago, we talked about Samatha-Vipassanā in the translations. And here, this is Bhante Sujato's translation. I've done a little bit of tweaking, but it's mostly just straight from Bhante Sujato. And he translates Samatha as serenity and Vipassana as discernment. And we'll get a little bit more into why he does that and some of the reasoning later on. But here the Buddha is saying, we should reflect, have I cultivated these two, right? And if we haven't, we should make an effort to do so. So this is very basic, but very straightforward, that we shouldn't be looking for one, right? So this is one thing that we have to keep in mind. The Buddha always brings these two qualities together, and we'll continue to see this again and again. These two qualities support one another. When the mind becomes serene and still, it can see clearly, it can investigate its experience, and it can start to gain insight or clarity about what the nature of our experience is. And when we start to see the nature of our experience, we start to let go. We start to disengage and start to generate wholesome qualities, peace, and more stillness. And so Samatha and Vipassana support one another. And so here the Buddha is asking, have we cultivated serenity, Samatha, and Vipassana? If not, we should make an effort to do so, to do both. He says, but suppose that upon checking, a mendicant knows that they have cultivated Samatha and Vipassana. They should dwell with rapture and joy, training day and night in wholesome qualities. So this is another interesting point. The Buddha is saying, if we do have Samatha Vipassana, so we check our mind and we see, oh, I have cultivated this. I have cultivated serenity. I have cultivated stillness. I have cultivated mental tranquility and peace. And I also have clarity in my mind, right? I understand what's going on in my mind. I'm aware. I can see the nature. I can understand how these processes are unfolding. If we have that, we should train with rapture and joy. Right, so this is something I have to break some bad news to everybody on the stream and in the future. The Buddha is saying we just have to suck up. We just have to suck it up and be happy. There's no excuse. Okay, we just have to be joyful. And I know it's tragic. It's horrible news. We can't just be grumpy and see everything clearly and I know how everything works. No, we have to actually be joyful. And unfortunately, that's the reality. So we have to cultivate happiness in our practice, and it should be easeful, beautiful practice, right? The Buddha says that the path is beautiful in the beginning, beautiful in the middle, and beautiful in the end. And he's saying, if you have Samatha and Vipassana, we should be training with rapture and joy. So rapture is piti. It's a kind of euphoria. It's a kind of very ecstatic joy and pleasure. And it's a little bit more bubbly, you could say, than just pleasure or just ease. And so, and joy, we all understand, another pleasant mental feeling. And so with these qualities, if we're doing Vipassana, if we're clearly seeing things, it should be joyful. It should be easeful. We should be enraptured, right? And the Buddha is saying this is how our practice should be going. And if we think about, for instance, the jhanas, or we think about deeper states of samadhi, there's joy there, right? There's rapture, there's ease. And that's the direction our practice should always be going, right? The Noble Eightfold Path leans towards Samma-Samadhi. And so when we cultivate Samatha Vipassana, it should always be easeful. And in another sutta, I've collected different quotes here that we can discuss. The Buddha says, as for the person who has serenity of mind but not discernment. So this is, let's say we're checking. So earlier on, the Buddha said we should check our mind. And if we have Samatha and Vipassana, then we should train rapture. We should cultivate those qualities even more. We should start to train our mind to be even more still, to be unshaken by the hindrances, to be unshaken by greed, hatred, and delusion, to be extremely still, to not have to engage constantly and distract ourselves. And if we don't have them, then we should work towards cultivating them. But so what do we do if, let's say, we see, okay, I don't have both, I don't have neither, I have a little bit of serenity. So the Buddha says we have a little bit of serenity of mind, but we don't have discernment. The Buddha says, grounded on serenity, they should strive for discernment. After some time, they have both serenity and discernment. Right, so grounded on serenity. So if we have samatha, we can sit still, and we don't need to distract ourselves with the senses. We don't need to distract ourselves with kind of imaginative thinking and proliferating different ideas. We can sit still and we can bring our mind into a state of calm and ease within our experience. But we don't really have much clarity. We don't have much discernment, right? This is one of the things. If our stillness doesn't lead to any kind of clarity, it's not the right type of samatha. So this is something to keep in mind, right? If our mind is if the point of samatha is just to have a still, calm mind, we might as well be sleeping, right? We might as well take some kind of substance that calms our mind, because that's much easier. It's much easier to calm our mind if we take some kind of drug or we just go to sleep. right? So the point is that that's not the right type of samatha, right? The right type of samatha is the type that leads to clarity, and it leads to freedom from the hindrances and unwholesome qualities. And it creates grounds for, like I said, our mind ground, our garden. As it gets more serene, it should become more wholesome, and it should lead us onwards, right? This is one of the qualities of the Dhamma. It's opanayika. This means that it leads us onward. And as we gain realization, as we start to become more peaceful, as we start to gain more discernment into our experience, it will lead us onwards constantly, right? And our experience will draw inward these qualities that we are trying to develop. So if we're cultivating samatha and vipassana, that should naturally, in the right way, lead us into deeper samatha and vipassana. It should lead us into deeper wisdom. It should lead us into deeper understanding, deeper peace, deeper freedom, liberation from grasping and agitation and hindrances and so forth. So when we cultivate samatha, it should be going in that direction. And this is why the Buddha is saying, if we do have samatha, if our mind can become still, then we should use that, grounded on serenity. They should strive for discernment, right? So we strive to gain this discernment, this clarity in our mind, using the serenity, right? So a practical example of this, which we'll also get to into more detail later on, is if our mind is very still and we see that, then try to understand how does the mind become still, right? What is the opposite of stillness? It's the five hindrances, right? It's seeking, it's gaining, it's not letting go. True peace in Buddhism is about letting go of our cravings, letting go of our desires, coming to stillness, coming to ease, coming to non-agitation, right? These same qualities I've talked about. And so you could kind of think about it, if the mind ground, our experience of the world, is our garden. If we're constantly agitated, chasing different pests, chasing different chipmunks, chasing different weeds and trying to pull them out and trying to constantly manage all the surface level problems in the garden, we can't just sit back and enjoy the garden, right? If we've cultivated a beautiful garden, we can just sit back and look, oh, wow, this is really nice, and just kind of enjoy it, become very serene and peaceful, right? But if we do that too much, then the weeds might sprouting again. And in that case, we need to start gaining, this doesn't work for the simile of the garden, but in terms of our actual mind, once we start understanding how those weeds arise, how these hindrances arise, how greed, hatred, and delusion manifest in our mind and drive us towards unwholesome qualities, once we start gaining clarity about that, then we can relax further into the garden. But if we just relax and we don't gain any clarity about the workings of our mind, then it won't lead us onwards, right? The Dhamma won't lead us into deeper realization. And so we should use our serenity. We should use that stable, clear, peaceful mind, which is free of hindrances, and start to understand, what is the opposite of this? How does the mind jump away from this in all postures? And then we'll start to have samatha and vipassana. And the Buddha says we'll have both, right? So again, we always come back to wanting both of these qualities. But if someone has discernment into principles of higher understanding, but not serenity, grounded on discernment, they should strive for serenity. After a while, they have both. So again, if we have one quality, we should always review our mind. Is my mind peaceful? Is my mind calm? Can my mind withstand my experience and become serene within it? Leaning towards more clarity, leaning towards more discernment. And if we do have discernment and clarity, does that lead me on towards stillness and peace, right? So here the Buddha is saying, let's say we have a little bit of discernment. So we understand how the hindrances arise. We understand how they cease. We have understanding about the nature of our body, and we can understand how, getting caught up in, say, pain or getting caught up in pleasure of the body leads to more agitation and mental unrest. We kind of see into these principles, and we see into how we grasp and create suffering for ourselves. Then we should use that. We should use that discernment. That's very profound, and that will lead us into deeper realization. We should cultivate that, and it will lead us into more serenity. It will lead us into peace, because once we see how we create our suffering, we don't do it. And this is a magical principle of Buddhism, not even of Buddhism, just of the mind. A magical principle is that once we see something, we see how it creates suffering for us, naturally we let it go. Right? So the Buddha says that when we see things clearly, it leads to dispassion. And when we're dispassionate, the mind is freed. Right? So this means that when we see things clearly, we become disenchanted and dispassionate towards those things, which is already leaning towards letting go. And when we become dispassionate towards those things, then the mind is freed, which is the deepest letting go, right? So seeing clearly should lead to peace. It should lead to a free mind, a liberated mind. And that's how we use our discernment and our understanding and our clarity about what's arising in our mind, how things arise in our mind, all of that. We use that to develop more serenity until we have both. What if we have neither, right? What if we're at the beginning of the path, or we're still working on the foundation, and we don't have much samatha, we don't have much stillness of mind, and we also don't have much clarity of mind. We don't have much discernment. Well, the Buddha says, if we have neither, in order to gain those wholesome qualities, so notice these are wholesome qualities always, these are qualities that our mind is endowed with, they should apply intense enthusiasm, effort, zeal, vigor, perseverance, mindfulness, and self-awareness. So how do we get samatha and vipassana? Well, these are two qualities that we should be endowed with. Our mind should have the quality of serenity. Our mind should have the quality of clarity and understanding. And if we don't have those, we apply the Noble Eightfold Path, right? And notice how these are kind of the steps of the path that lead up to right samadhi. So effort, zeal, vigor, perseverance, enthusiasm, that's things like the right intention and also right effort, right? So samma sankappa and samma vayama, these are two factors of the path. We put in effort, and we cultivate mindfulness, sati, and self-awareness, sampajanya. Self-awareness or sampajanya is understanding of what's arising and how things, what is going on within me, we could say. What is going on within my mind and within my body, and how am understanding kind of where we're at, you could say. So mindfulness, we just bring into mind certain qualities and we bear these in mind, but we also have to add self-awareness into that, right? So if we're just very, very mindful, but we're not really aware within that mindfulness of what else is arising or how the mind is responding to the mindfulness, etc., and what's going on around us, especially if we're walking and things like that, well, that mindfulness is, it's not going to lead us to a very safe place, because you could say it's the idiot's mindfulness, right? Idiot's mindfulness is the mindfulness that we don't have any self-awareness. We cultivate mindfulness, but we don't have any awareness of what's arising and how it's affecting us, right? So we have to be aware. We cultivate that, and we put in effort and zeal. So we raise up wholesome qualities. We let go of unwholesome qualities. We endure our experience to see how we create suffering within it, using these principles of mindfulness and self-awareness, and also this enthusiasm. So this interest and this desire, a wholesome form of desire, to actually try to understand, to try to gain serenity, to try to practice, right? We have to have that enthusiasm. When we do that, we become endowed with both serenity and discernment. And as for the person who has both serenity and discernment, the Buddha says, grounded on those wholesome qualities, so we have these qualities in our mind, we should use them to practice further to end the defilements. And here is one of the recurring themes, is that the qualities of mind of samatha and vipassana, once we have both of them, so notice before the Buddha was saying we need to check if we have both, and if we only have one, we need to develop the other. And once we have both, we should practice further to end the defilements. So the Noble Eightfold Path, it should be leading us into a state of both samatha and vipassana. And then the Buddha points us onwards. Okay, now that you have both, cultivate those further, bring them into more kind of strength, and bring them into more clarity, more power, and use those to end the defilements. So use those to completely eradicate our suffering. So if our mind is very still and free from suffering, and we're very clear about the nature of our mind and the nature of how suffering arises in this conditionality, bring that even further. Make our mind even more still, right? Because what is the ultimate stillness? What's the ultimate serenity? What's the ultimate peace? Freedom from greed, hatred, and delusion. Freedom from grasping. Freedom from suffering. So you could say that the whole path is about samatha, right? It's all samatha all the time. Because if the mind is completely serene and unshakable and peaceful, that means it's free from defilements, and it's free from greed, hatred, and delusion to ever arise. So really, all we need is samatha if the samatha is right. But on the other hand, we can say the same with vipassana. If we clearly see everything, we clearly see the nature of things and the nature of the arising of suffering, as I talked about, we don't create that suffering. We let go. We let go of this concept of self and this concept of conceit that grasps onto phenomena and tries to find safety in them. But once we see how they arise and cease and how they function, we don't do that anymore. So ultimately, deep vipassana leads to the eradication of suffering. So both vipassana and samatha brought to fruition is the ending of suffering. But like I said, if we only have samatha, well, we might as well go to sleep. And if we only have vipassana, well, that means that our clarity about experience probably isn't that actually clear. Because if we're clear about what's happening, but we're not free from suffering, we're not free from unwholesome qualities, and we're still very agitated and worked up and pressured, well, then that clarity hasn't really come into maturation. It hasn't really become mature. So we use both samatha and vipassana. We ground ourselves in these two qualities to end the defilements. And so we've talked a little bit about this, but what exactly is the point of having samatha, right? So when the Buddha talks about what exactly are the different functions, so we've been talking about how, samatha and vipassana both are qualities that lead to the end of suffering, how both are mutually supportive, how we need both, how we cultivate both. And I gave in the last talk the simile of still water and how water has dirt in it. And when there's dirt particles flowing around, there's agitation there, and there's also lack of clarity, right? And vice versa. But so we see how these kind of interrelate, but what are the actual individual particulars? Because they're not the same, right? So this is something, samatha is not the same as vipassana. They're different words, they have different meanings, right? They refer to different aspects of our mind. So they're mutually supportive, they're mutually present, and they mutually develop, and they mutually they're mutual tools that we're grounded on to end our suffering, but they do have separate roles. And the Buddha talks about this. So what is the benefit of developing samatha? The Buddha says. He says the mind is developed. So the benefit of developing samatha is that we develop our mind. The Pali word here is chitta. And what is the benefit of developing the mind? Passion, or raga, is given up. So the point of samatha is developing the mind. And you might think that's what all Buddhism is about, isn't it? If we think about the Ovada Patimokkha, so this is a series of it's a verse that the Buddha summarized kind of the whole training. And one of the famous verses from this is, we give up doing evil and unwholesome actions. We take on the wholesome and we purify the mind. This is the teaching of all the Buddhas. This is the teaching of the Buddhas. So Buddhism is about giving up unwholesome action, cultivating these wholesome qualities, and purifying our mind. So the mind developing, we could say that's what Buddhism's about, right? And the Buddha, what is the point of the mind developing? It's passion, giving up passion. And this is something I just talked about. The opposite of passion, of raga, is dispassion. In Pali, this is viraga, so viraga. And viraga is the direct condition for liberation. In another place, the Buddha says, the highest of all dhammas, the highest of all qualities, of all phenomena, the highest phenomena of all, whether conditioned or unconditioned, is viraga. So samatha leads to viraga, right? Is the Buddha saying. It leads to developing our mind, right? Because our mind is caught up in phenomena. It's caught up in appearances. It's caught up in the world. It's caught up in creating suffering and sensual desire and ill will and restlessness and becoming dull and avoiding reality, or becoming agitated and becoming overworked by reality, or just doubting reality and becoming very unclear about what to do. Our mind is caught up. And when we cultivate serenity and stillness, we learn to kind of fortify our mind and make it strong, make it peaceful and easeful, so that in the face of different events that might happen, in the face of different appearances, in the face of different thoughts, or any of the experiences that we can have through the senses, whether sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, or mental phenomena, our mind can be still, serene, unmoved, peaceful, joyful, right, with rapture and joy. Then we're going to let go of all those phenomena, including even the mental phenomena eventually will happen. So that's the purpose of samatha. But what is the benefit of developing discernment, or vipassana? The Buddha says understanding is developed. And what is the benefit of developing understanding? Ignorance is given up. So the benefit, the distinct, discrete, unique benefit of vipassana, of discernment, of clarity, is understanding. And the Pali word is panya. You might have seen this translated most commonly as wisdom, which isn't incorrect, but I think understanding kind of gets at it a little bit better what the word panya actually means. Right? Sometimes we think of wisdom, it's kind of some kind of knowledge that we have, but panya is actually more of a understanding. So we understand our experience. And it's kind of Vipassana. When I talked about it in the last talk, I talked about how Vipassana, it kind of starts with developing sampajanya, and then that sampajanya will lead into panya. So the word pajanya is related to panya. So when we develop sampajanya and we cultivate that properly along the Noble Eightfold Path, it will lead into panya. And we develop sati, that samatha, sati will lead into samadhi. So sati leads to samadhi, sampajanya leads to panya. You could kind of say this. And so sampajanya is this awareness of what's happening, and panya is this clear understanding within that. So we're not just aware, we're not just discerning, but we're also completely understanding it. And so panya is it's that function. It's related to the verb pajanati, which means to understand. So panya is this understanding or this wisdom that we have. So when we develop discernment, of course, we develop understanding. When we start to see reality, when we start to have clarity about what's happening, well, what are we developing there? We're developing understanding. And when we develop understanding, we give up ignorance, which is avijja. So just as with samatha, we give up raga, which leads to liberation. When we give up avijja and we give up ignorance, that also leads to liberation, right? What's the beginning of all of the suffering? Avijja, independent origination. We have avijja paccaya sankhara eva metassa kevalasa dukkha khandassa samudaya hoti. So with avijja as condition, this whole massive suffering comes to be. Avijjaya tveva sesa viraga nirodha, with the complete cessation, fading, dispassion towards ignorance. That is how the entire massive suffering comes to cease. So ignorance is kind of the root of all of our suffering, because we don't understand things. So we get caught up in suffering. We create suffering for ourselves because we don't understand it. So samatha is when we let go of that process of creating suffering. And vipassana is when we understand that process of creating suffering. And eventually these two converge. Again, repeating myself a little bit, but from a different angle, eventually these two converge. When we fully understand, we let go. When we fully let go, we understand. Samatha Vipassana come together into the fruition of Nibbana. So one of the things that I was planning on talking about, we don't have a lot of time, and there's kind of I wanted to get into some of the Buddha's specific ways of cultivating Samatha Vipassana. But there's one thing is that when we talk about defining the word Vipassana, there's this interesting story in the Digha Nikaya about a past Buddha called Prince Vipassi or Buddha Vipassi. And Vipassi is related to Vipassana. So we can see, why is he called Vipassi? So Vipassi is kind of one who has Vipassana, or one who sees clearly. The sutta says, from when he was born, Prince Vipassi had the power of clairvoyance, so this is the divine eye, which manifested as a result of past deeds, by which he could see for a league all around, both by day and night. So we had this little baby who's born, and he can see, he has night vision. This might be the first occurrence in history of night vision, but without any night vision goggles. So he can see in the dark for a whole league, and he can see in the day very far. So he has very good vision, and this is kind of a manifestation of his past karma, it says. And he was unblinkingly watchful, like the gods of the 33. And because it was said that he was unblinkingly watchful, he came to be known as Vipassi. So this verb is pekati, related to upeka. So it means looking over or looking. So he's constantly looking. He has clarity about what's happening, even in the dark. He sees. That's why he's called Vipassi. Right? So this word Vipassana, it has this aspect of seeing, like I talked about before. It also says, then while King Bandhuma was sitting in judgment, so this is kind of in city council meetings, you could say, a court kind of disputes, he'd sit Prince Vipassi in his lap and explain the case to him. And sitting there in his father's lap, Vipassi would thoroughly consider the case and draw a conclusion using a logical procedure. So this was all the more reason for him to be known as Vipassi. So here we see the other aspect of Vipassana. So not only is it seeing with great clarity what's happening, but it's also discerning. So when he was told about a court case, he was told all the details of the case, he could kind of discern into it and come to a conclusion, it says. So it's not just that we see what's happening or we hear what's happening, right? We also can kind of see into it and discern into it. These are the two aspects of Vipassana. So clarity about what's arising and also understanding it. And that's what I talked about before. Sampajanya leading into panya. So clarity and self-awareness leading into deep understanding. These are kind of two aspects of Vipassana. But so we can move on and try to go through this a little bit quicker here. So we talked about the distinct benefits of Samatha-Vipassanā, and we talked a little bit about what Vipassana exactly is, and we talked about what Samatha is. So we can see how these two come together. Like I said, contaminated by passion, the mind is not freed, and contaminated by ignorance, understanding does not grow. So this is what I said. We need both of these qualities. The mind being free from suffering, and contaminated by ignorance, understanding does not grow. Deep wisdom and understanding of reality. This is understanding the Four Noble Truths, understanding conditionality. That is the realization of Nibbana. And so both of these come together, the Buddha is saying, Samatha-Vipassanā. And so we have talked about, okay, they come together and also they have separate functions. And we talked about having one developing the other, etc. But how exactly do we develop? Let's say we have samatha, but we don't have much clarity about our experience and discernment into it. How do we develop that? And the Buddha, one way he says this is we should ask, how should conditions, how should sankharas be regarded? How should they be investigated? How should they be clearly seen? So this is, if we don't have much clarity and discernment, these are the questions we should be asking ourselves and also other people who are ahead of us on the path and who do have clarity. So how should we see conditions? How should they be investigated, right? This is what I was talking about, where Vipassana is an awareness of conditions as they arise, as they pass away, and how they arise, how they pass away. Because we're not just passive observers in our experience, okay? We create our experience. Like I said, the mind ground, this garden that we're dwelling in, we're constantly cultivating it. So if we're just sitting back and just observing the garden, you might think, oh, I'm not doing anything. Actually, you're allowing the garden to grow. So if there's weeds in the garden and you just watch the weeds, well, you're allowing weeds to grow. So that's what you're doing, right? You're giving time and space for weeds to grow because the garden grows of its own accord. We just put in the conditions to cultivate it constantly in all four postures, right? So our mind ground, the kind of our experience of this stream of consciousness and this karmic experience that we're having, it's the result of past deeds, and we're creating and cultivating it at the same time. And so we're not just kind of the victims of our experience. This is the experience that we've created for ourselves and brought ourselves into. So we have to cultivate it in a certain way. And so the Buddha is saying we should, if we don't have much clarity and discernment, we need to start observing and asking ourselves how to investigate, see, and regard the conditions within our experience. But let's say we do have some clarity about that, but our mind isn't very peaceful. We should ask, how should the mind be stilled? How should it be settled? How should it be unified? How should it be collected? And this is talking about samadhi. So we have clarity, but let's say we have clarity about the Dhamma, we have clarity about our experience, but we're constantly thinking about it. Well, that's not going to do us much good, right? If we're constantly thinking and we're not free, we don't actually, the clarity doesn't lead to an actual letting go, an actual experience of peace, an actual experience of freedom from suffering. Then we need to start asking ourselves, how can I still my mind? How can I settle, unify, and collect it in samadhi? Because samma samadhi, right samadhi, is the culmination of samatha-vipassanā. So when right view, when right understanding culminates through right effort and right mindfulness into a deep letting go in an experience, an experiential, you could say, realization of that view, that is right samadhi. Which won't yet be necessarily fruition or a deep, you could say, insight or deep realization, but it will be kind of the culmination of right view with right effort and right mindfulness. And that right samadhi will lead into, once we understand that process of letting go, that's when we have the realization of grasping and non-self and conditionality, how we create our suffering by grasping on and kind of fueling our mind, propelling it forward into samsara. So right samadhi is the culmination of samatha and vipassana. And once we understand that samadhi, once we have that fruition of that samadhi and we understand it, we don't just kind of have it as some kind of novel mystical experience. We understand it with our right view and with our samatha and vipassana, then that leads to realization. So we should be asking ourselves, if we're not going towards right samadhi, how we should, if we don't have much clarity, we use this question about how we regard and see and investigate sankharas. And if we have clarity, but we don't have much stillness, we ask about how we relate our mind to those sankharas, how we still our mind amongst them. So the primary example of this is the awakening factors, okay? The bojjhangas. The bojjhangas, there are 7 factors that the Buddha gives. Sati, Dhammavicca, Vidya, Piti, Passaddhi, Samadhi, Upekkha. And that is mindfulness, investigation by way of Dhamma or investigation of the Dhamma, investigation of our experience. Vidya is kind of this energy and perseverance, effort. Energy might be a better term for it, or vigor. Piti is this rapture, this joy. Passaddhi is tranquility, calm, serenity. But not just samatha in terms of the mind being stilled, but passaddhi is a kind of relaxation or tranquility of body and mind, a very easeful experience. Samadhi, the unification and gathering together of the mind. So it's completely kind of, we don't have a scattered mind which is doing separate different functions and being pulled here and there. It's completely unified together. And then upekkha is this clarity. It's this looking into our experience with deep, unshakable equanimity and clarity, right? That's what I was talking about, where samadhi culminates in this deep vipassana, in deep samatha, right? Because we're completely unmoved and stilled, and our mind is completely unified and working together without the biases of sensual desire, of agitation, of dullness. It's completely awake, clear, alert, still, unbiased. You could say unbiased, quote unquote. And we're seeing things. So upekkha is the culmination of both of those qualities. That's why it's kind of at the top of the bojjhangas. And so if you look into these bojjhangas, sati, we draw our mind into our experience. We become aware and mindful of some aspect of our experience, usually through the satipatthanas, the establishment of sati. The Buddha recommends, right? He talks about establishing our experience into the experience of the body, our feelings, our mind states, and the principles or the qualities and how they arise and cease, right? Dhammanupassana's seeing, the Buddha says, how the hindrances, how they arise, how they cease, etc., and also the awakening factors. So understanding our experience and kind of bringing mindfulness into that experience. And so when we do this, that's sati. And then we apply dhammavicca. So we start to investigate and discern, what am I doing that's causing suffering? What am I doing that's leading to more ease and letting go and freedom from suffering? That's dhammavicca. So that's vipassana. So sati is establishing samatha. Dhammavicca is establishing vipassana. Vidya, energy, is when we bring these two together. We push them on, urge them on to cultivate them together. And then that will lead into piti. The Buddha said, right? When we have both samatha and vipassana, in this previous sutta I talked about, we should train day and night with rapture and joy. So sati and dhammavicca with vidya, with these two qualities in vidya, they lead into piti and passaddhi, rapture, joy, ease, tranquility. But it's a different tranquility from the tranquility or ease that comes from sensuality. It comes from letting go. It comes from clarity. It comes from stillness. And once we do that, it leads into right samadhi. Just like I said before, samatha-vipassana lead into right samadhi. And that right samadhi experience will lead into a deep clarity, letting go. That's the upekkha, right? And this can be to different degrees. So it might not be at the level of attaining arahantship, right? But it might be at the level of gaining a little bit of deeper wisdom and understanding and peace and freedom. So it's the bojjhangas can function from day one to the final day of our practice, up to after we finish our practice. The Buddha continued to cultivate the bojjhangas. His disciples continue to cultivate the bojjhangas. It's just that they have access to them now and they can kind of abide in them. So the bojjhangas, if you want to understand how samatha and vipassana work together and how the Buddha envisioned meditation, how he envisioned mental cultivation, the bojjhangas are a perfect example of that. This is the Buddha's primary teaching, you could say, on mental cultivation, because when we talk about satipatthana, the Buddha says the satipatthanas, the establishment of mindfulness, that fulfills the bojjhangas. So the whole point of establishing mindfulness with the 4 satipatthana, the aspects of mindfulness meditation, you could say, the whole point of that is to fulfill the bojjhangas. So the bojjhangas, he says, fulfill knowledge and liberation. So fulfilling the bojjhangas is the key of the Buddha's teaching on mental development. And when we look at the Bojjhangas, it's completely based and surrounded, it kind of functioning around this pivot, this central piece of bringing together Samatha and Vipassana. So clarity about how we create our suffering, clarity about where the hindrances are, how they arise, how to let go of them, how we grasp and create and cling and try to find safety in things that are unstable, and also serenity, stillness, samadhi, joy. And both Samatha and Vipassana should lead into that joy, like I talked about. So again, it's inevitable. I'm sorry, everybody, bad news, but the Buddha said we just have to be joyful. So that's kind of can't be repeated too much, because it's, we should be developing wholesome joy. Not joy, again, we shouldn't be seeking joy. The joy comes from letting go of seeking, not needing anything. All our needs are fulfilled when we don't have any needs. So that's kind of Samatha Vipassana, leading into this stillness amongst our experience. And we can do that with anything. So one example the Buddha gives of this for actual practical instruction, you could say. This is the Pali. Kaye kayanupassino viharata atapino sampajana eko dibhuta vipassana citta samahita ekaggacitta kayasya yatha bhutang jnanaya. So what does that nonsensical string of syllables mean if you understand Pali? Dwell observing an aspect of the body, ardent, aware, at one, with minds that are clear, collected in samadhi and unified, so as to know the body as it has come to be. So again, look how interesting this is. I put the Pali here so that we can see. This is talking about developing mindfulness of the body, right? Which we all should be relatively familiar with. This is the first step, say, of the Bojjhangas, for instance. Ardent, atapino, this is the energy. This is the effort that we have to be putting into cultivating our qualities. Sampajana, this is the sampajanya. So this is the awareness. This is a little bit of vipassana already here. Eko dibhuta, this is having become one. And this is the same word, ekodi, is used for the second jhana. So unifying our mind into oneness. But it also says vipassana citta. Sounds a lot like vipassana, right? It's not exactly the same word, but it means basically roughly the same thing. And I think the Buddha, is using this word because it is essentially the same thing. It sounds so familiar. Vipassana here, it means clear, very clear. So a clear mind. It's crystal clear, like water when all the dust has settled. So our mind, we're very aware of our experience, and our mind is unified. And so it's very clear, the Buddha is saying. We should have a clarity of mind. So Samatha and Vipassana are here. Samahita, that's for samadhi. So again, this is the samadhi. This is the samatha side. And ekaggacitta, so the mind is, again, united. But we do this, kayasya yatha bhutang jnanaya, for fully understanding the body as it is, or as it has come to be. So here, the Buddha is kind of, again, pointing us to how Samatha Vipassana come together using mindfulness meditation. So we cultivate mindfulness. And we do that with Samatha and Vipassana in order to fully understand the body. So here we're cultivating samadhi, we're cultivating clarity, we're cultivating stillness, we're cultivating understanding and awareness. All of that leading to the fruition of letting go and stilling of greed, hatred, and delusion, and understanding of dukkha and the cause of dukkha, to let go of it. So here are the Buddha's practical instructions for mindfulness meditation. You can find this in the Satipatthana Samyutta. We see how Samatha Vipassana come together. And again, this is part of the Bojjhangas. So when we understand with mindfulness how we create our suffering and how we let go of our suffering, and we still our mind amidst that, and let go deeper and understand deeper, that's our practice of mindfulness, of the Bojjhangas of Samatha Vipassana. Another example of the Buddha talking about this is in Majjhima Nikaya 19. So he talks about discerning wholesome. I have this written down here, but I think it'll be better if I say it. In Majjhima Nikaya 19, the Buddha talks about how he discerned his thinking processes, and he distinguished the wholesome from the unwholesome. So what leads to suffering and what leads to freedom from suffering? That's vipassana. Clarity about what's going on in our mind and what creates suffering and what doesn't, that's vipassana. Then he starts to understand how those thoughts arise and let go of the thoughts. That's vipassana and samatha together. And then he stills the thoughts gradually, letting go of more and more coarse thoughts, more and more coarse into more and more refined, until he lets go of the agitation and the distracting, the thought process, into a deep stillness and clarity, which is samadhi. And that leads into liberation. So if you want to see how Samatha-Vipassanā come together, another example, Majjhima Nikaya 19, right? Another example in the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha talks, one committed to the higher mind has coarse corruptions, bad bodily, verbal, and mental conduct. A sincere, capable mendicant gives them up, gets rid of them, eliminates and obliterates them. So Samatha-Vipassanā starts with our sila and our sense restraint. If we are so shaken and agitated by the sight of a living being that we kill it, the lack of Samatha-Vipassanā there is massive. Okay, we can't even begin to cultivate Samatha-Vipassanā sitting still. Even if you think you're doing that, you're not doing that, because there's probably deep layers of delusion. You can't kill beings, you can't steal and break the 5 precepts without some essential level of Samatha-Vipassanā. You have to understand how the suffering is not in the living being. The suffering is in your unwholesome mind states that arise dependent on your thought process and proliferation and sight and sound of living beings that would lead you to kill them, right? So the precepts, that is cultivating Samatha-Vipassanā. And if we don't cultivate the precepts, if you haven't cultivated the precepts, you won't be able to cultivate Samatha-Vipassanā at a deeper level. And if you have cultivated the precepts, but you haven't been relating to it very deeply, I just follow the precepts because the Buddha said so. No, you should be looking in. Why can't I break the precepts? We should really be understanding, what's the problem with killing? What's the problem with stealing? What's the problem with sexual misconduct? And understand, what does following these precepts, how does that relate to my mind, my mental cultivation? And you'll see Samatha-Vipassanā very, very clearly. I'm not going to give you the answer to this because I think you all should investigate your precepts, but it's very clear that the Buddha is very clear that that's essential, and it's also something we can see for ourselves. And as this is saying, the very most coarse level of corruption, the coarse level of defilement, which is the creation of suffering, is bad bodily, verbal, and mental conduct. And not being clear about that and how it arises, how it ceases, and how it creates suffering is a lack of vipassana. Once we give those things up, we just have different levels of thoughts. So wrong thought, the Buddha says we have to see into that and give it up. And then we might have more subtle thoughts, like, okay, we don't have sensual and cruel thoughts, but we might have lingering thoughts about, lay life or, our family. Let's say you're meditating, you're trying to develop clarity and stillness within your experience, and you start getting thoughts about what you're going to do later on that day. That isn't necessarily sensual, but it likely is sensual. But if it isn't, there might be more subtle things like family, country, etc. And once we give those up, the Buddha says all that's left are thoughts about the Dhamma. That samadhi is not peaceful or sublime or tranquil or unified, but is held in place by force. So once we've given up, we've samatha, we've gained clarity into the creation of suffering and the thought process that creates suffering and how we let go of them. That's vipassana. We develop that. And once we've stilled our mind, we might only have thoughts about the Dhamma, but even those thoughts eventually have to be let go of, because the Dhamma is not something that we think about. It's a freedom from suffering. And so eventually we have to understand how that creates suffering and let go of it. And once we do that, the Buddha says, eventually that mind is stilled internally. It settles, unifies, and becomes immersed in samadhi. They become capable of realizing anything to which they extend the mind. So here, through the cultivation of samatha and vipassana, in order to still our mind and understand how we create suffering through our mental habits and bodily, verbal, and mental conduct, and then our subtle thought processes, and through developing right samadhi by the culmination of samatha vipassana together, we become capable of realizing anything to which we extend the mind. We see similar things here with satipatthana. So the Buddha says a noble disciple has 4 kinds of mindfulness meditation as tethers for the mind, so as to subdue behaviors of the lay life, memories and thoughts of the lay life, and realize nibbana. So again, through the bojjhangas and developing mindfulness of our experience through the satipatthana, establishment of mindfulness, we develop samatha and vipassana to let go of suffering and realize nibbana, develop clarity into our experience and how we create suffering, into conditionality of suffering, and letting go of that suffering to still our mind. I'm going to start turning to questions, but I do want to close up by kind of zooming through just a couple different examples here. besides what I've talked about. So there's a couple other examples I thought might be good. So in Majjhima Nikaya 149, the Buddha says again, together, what are the things that should be cultivated? Serenity, samatha, and discernment, vipassana. And he gives an example. When you truly know and see the eye, sights, eye contact, eye consciousness, etc., and what is felt as pleasant, painful, or neutral dependent on the eye, you're not aroused by those things, and you will experience physical and mental pleasure. And these two qualities proceed in conjunction, serenity and discernment. Right? So notice here, we're discerning our sense experience. We're discerning the arising of sense experience and how sense experience functions in order to be free from agitation and desire in regards to those things and stilling the mind. And then we experience physical and mental pleasure. And the Buddha says that's cultivating samatha and vipassana. So you might think, oh, that's vipassana meditation. Well, like I said many times before, if you're just cultivating vipassana, there's no samatha arising. You're not cultivating, you're not being free from the senses. You're not developing joy and pleasure from that letting go and ease, and you're not cultivating both samatha and vipassana. That's not the right type of practice, right? Because the Buddha is saying when we do this clarity and understanding of the sense basis, it will lead into samatha, vipassana, mental joy, samadhi, etc. Another way the Buddha talks about, a noble disciple reflects on this, sensual pleasures, sensual perceptions in this life and in lives to come, both of these are Mara's domain, Mara's realm, and Mara's territory. Why don't I meditate with an abundant, expansive heart, having mastered the world and stabilized the mind? Then I will have no more bad, unskillful qualities, such as desire, ill will, etc. So here, by reflecting and using our clarity into the suffering and peril of sensual desire and chasing sensuality, we turn into developing an abundant, expansive mind or heart, stabilizing it and being free of the hindrances. So via reflection and understanding, we develop samatha. And with that samatha, it's saying, then I will have no more bad, unskillful qualities, such as desire, ill will, etc. And so we're free of those qualities, and we have even more clarity into the creation of suffering and the letting go of suffering. So here, samatha and vipassana again come together. This is another example of the Buddha's meditation instructions. Another example, a mendicant, ignoring the perception of the village and people, focuses on the oneness dependent on the perception of wilderness. Their mind becomes secure, confident, settled, and decided in that. So here we are focusing on samatha. We're stilling our mind away from diversity and bringing it into oneness. And the mind becoming secure, confident, settled, and decided means essentially the mind becoming still. And this is referring to samadhi. And then once we do that, we understand here there is no stress due to the perception of village or of people. There is only this modicum of stress, namely the oneness dependent on the perception of wilderness. And so they regard it as empty of what is not there, but as to what remains, they understand that it is present. So here, we cultivate samadhi, serenity, oneness. We get rid of diversity, and we cultivate our mind into a more stable, secure, confident, peaceful, unified state. And then we understand the letting go of suffering by doing that, and the remaining suffering that's still there. And we understand what is present is what's present, what's not present is what's not present, and we get insight into how we create suffering and how we let go of suffering. So here the cultivation of samatha and samadhi, etc., is then brought together into deep understanding about the arising and conditionality of dukkha. And the Buddha brings this onward all the way up to nibbana. Other examples of this are the Datta Vibhanga Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 140, where we understand the elements and we see them as not self. So we develop serenity and deep mental stillness in regards to the experience of the body and the elements. And then we understand how those elements are not ourself. And we detach the mind from them, so we develop more serenity. And then it proceeds like this, back and forth, Samatha-Vipassanā, constantly supporting one another into the realization of Nibbana. And so from the Bojjhangas to the four Satipatthanas to different suttas on details of how the Buddha recommended we meditate or cultivate our mind ground, from sila to deeper reflection on the sense bases and aggregates, etc. All of that, Samatha-Vipassana, are these two qualities that we constantly develop and we constantly check ourselves for, and we constantly bring into deeper fruition, deeper culmination, leading along the same Noble Eightfold Path we all should be familiar with, into right samadhi and into deep letting go. So I'll finish here for now, everyone, and I hope that was beneficial. There's more that I could say. There's more examples from the suttas that I've collected about even deeper understanding of conditionality, using Satipatthana and understanding the body and all of that. But we can talk about that another time, and I highly recommend you read the suttas. I recommend you read the Satipatthana Samyutta, read the Majjhima Nikaya, read the entire Sutta Pitaka, but especially the suttas that relate to Samatha-Vipassanā. Read every reference, and you'll start to see how they're not separate practices, okay? They're qualities that we develop that build on one another on the same Noble Eightfold Path. So I'll close here for now, and I'll start taking questions, and if we have any, or if not, we can end for the morning. So hello again. I've said hello to some, but it looks like Jayanta, Spook, Prashanta, Manal, Luisa, Usha, Charleslie, Seema, Bhumika, Sud, lots of people. Pial. Hello, everybody. I have a question, it looks like, from Indigenous Toy Switching, maybe. Venerable, I have one question. Where do Buddhists believe morality comes from, if not God? So this is a little bit off topic. It might be best to ask this on Friday. We'll be having a special monk chat, but there'll still be questions. But just to kind of really briefly answer your question, it's not going to be satisfactory, but morality comes from our own wisdom, our own understanding, and our own decisions, okay, from our own mind that we cultivate to develop, like I said, our mind ground, our experience of the mind and reality. And so morality is coming from within, you could say. And if you're asking why are we moral if God doesn't tell us to, it's because certain qualities develop suffering, and those are called unwholesome qualities, and other qualities develop happiness. And we all want to be happy. And it just so happens that things like killing make suffering for ourselves and others. So that's where that idea comes from. So again, Samatha-Vipassanā, right? Morality, sila, that is Samatha-Vipassanā. PL asks, for right mindfulness, do you need all three qualities, mindfulness, alertness, and effort? Sati, sampajanya, and atapi is actually more of an adjective or description. But yes, you do need all three qualities. So when the Buddha defines samasati, right mindfulness, he defines it literally as, for instance, kaye kayanupasi. So we dwell, viharati, we dwell observing the body or an aspect of the body with mindfulness, alertness, and ardency or effort. And so, yes, these are right. That is necessary for right mindfulness, because right mindfulness means sati sampajanya come together. Like I said, we don't want to have idiots mindfulness, where we're mindful of the body, but we're completely unaware of how that's affecting our mind. We're just kind of staring at it. This is kind of what the Buddha calls donkey meditation. If we act like a donkey, we have hay in front of us and we think, hey, hey, hey. We're not developing any wisdom. So the Buddha says, don't meditate like that. Okay, so that's kind of idiot's mindfulness. We need to have mindfulness of what's happening and of the body, but we also need to have awareness. And the effort, that's the effort to remove our mind towards, remove the kind of momentum of mind towards unwholesome and bring it towards wholesomeness and rest it in Samatha-Vipassanā. So the effort is basically continue striving, continue persisting and enduring your sati sampajanya to develop Samatha-Vipassanā, joy, etc. So yeah, all of those things, they should come naturally. You shouldn't really need to think about them separately if you're practicing correctly. They should all kind of be together in one package. Sud, hello, says, Dear Venerable, so does this mean as one keeps practicing samatha, the side effect is giving up of raga? Yeah, so yeah, it does mean that. Because what is, like I said, what is the ultimate samatha? What's the ultimate stillness? Actually, when the Buddha defines nibbana, he says, etang santang etang panitang yadidang sabba sankhara samatho sabbopadiparinisago tanhakkayo vidago. So he talks about, essentially, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but the very first word he uses to define it, etang santang etang panitang, this is sublime, this is peaceful. That is sabba sankhara samatho, the samatha of all conditions. So the first word that the Buddha uses to define nibbana is samatha. And the other word he uses to define nibbana, vidaga. Etang santang, etang panitang, yadidang sabba sankhara samatho, sabbopatinisago, tanhakyo vidago. So the Buddha uses samatha and vidaga as two, you could say, synonyms for nibbana. So if we do bring samatha to culmination, it would be, yeah, the stilling of greed, hatred, delusion, the stilling of conditions, the stilling of suffering. That's samatha. But like I said, it can't be, again, the idiot's samatha. It's a little bit of a harsh phrase, but I say it, maybe it will be useful to remember, is that would just be going to sleep, right? So if you're just stilling your mind into a stupor, into unawareness, into a dull state where it doesn't have mindfulness, it doesn't have clarity, etc., that's not the right type of samatha. It should be samatha of suffering, but the suffering is not to be found in um, the way that we create suffering, our grasping process. That's not to be found in the things themselves necessarily. It's related to those things. It's dependent on those things. It's not separate from them, but it's not them in and of themselves, right? So if we grasp on to the body, we let go, we still that process, that samatha. We don't need to become unaware of the body. We can let go of the body. We don't need it, but we shouldn't be dulling our mind away from awareness. So samatha, if cultivated rightly, the side effect is giving up of raga. And even if you don't bring it to full nibbana, yeah, the Buddha says that when you cultivate samatha, it leads to giving up raga. Because I'll speak about this a little bit because it's important. The jhanas are you could say, one of the deepest experiences of samadhi, of right samadhi. And in the jhanas, you've completely let go of sensuality. The jhanas are based off of letting go of all sensuality, of sense pleasures, of all unwholesome qualities. And once you experience the extreme bliss and ease and freedom from suffering that comes from letting go of sensuality, then you become dispassionate towards sensuality. So the Buddha says that someone who has, if someone's not free of passion and desire for the senses, it's because they haven't really experienced a pleasure higher than that. And when he says that, he's referring to jhana. And this has to be the right jhana. So it has to be jhana with right view and understanding and everything like that. But if you really understand jhana and you really let go of sensuality, it comes from understanding. Jhana comes from letting go by understanding sensuality. Like in the other sutta I read, when we understand the peril of sensual pleasures, we let go of them and cultivate samadhi. And it also culminates in understanding, because once we let go, we realize, oh, my grasping before, that was the cause of my suffering. And these sensual pleasures aren't worth going after. So samatha, even if you don't develop if you don't become an arahant or something, it will still lead, if it's cultivated properly, into freedom from passion. Hope that's helpful. Pial says, is pure vipassana practice not possible? In AN 4.170, I believe it says you can get to vipassana from samatha and samatha from vipassana, or practice both in tandem. Thanks. Yeah, good question. So this is what I talked about at the beginning of the talk, where it is possible to have, for our mind to have more clarity than stillness and more discernment than stillness. And the Buddha says, if you are in that position, then what's your job? He says your job is to cultivate the opposite. So if you do have vipassana, but it's not leading to deep samatha and right samadhi and everything, where the two come together, then the Buddha says you're not ready to practice further to end the defilements, right? The Buddha always says you cultivate both these qualities. If you only have one, you use that to cultivate the other. And once you have both, then you apply further effort to completely eradicate the defilements and all suffering. So it's possible to do, to cultivate vipassana more than samatha. You can emphasize it more. But if it's not leading into both being present, then it's not right. Because like I read the other sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 149, where the Buddha says, you develop clarity in vipassana about the sense bases and the arising of the sense bases and the suffering and etc. He says that leads to non-arousal and then joy and mental pleasure and ease. So it leads into samatha. Because once we understand something, we don't need to keep thinking about it. We don't need to keep analyzing it and looking at it. We just let it go. Right? Once we understand something, we just let go. That's how easy it is. Nibbana is it's a process of understanding and letting go and understanding. And so if our vipassana doesn't lead to letting go and stillness and unification, it's not right. But it is possible to cultivate that. And if you don't have, let's say you do have serenity, but you don't have much clarity, you should, the Buddha says, lean into understanding a little bit better the arising of your, how your experience works and how you create suffering. So you can lean more to the vipassana side, but again, bad news, everybody. Once you do Vipassana, it's naturally going to make you more peaceful. I'm sorry, but it's just going to lead to more peace and ease and freedom from suffering. And the same with the Samatha. When you cultivate Samatha rightly, I'm sorry, everybody, but it's going to lead into deeper understanding and realization. So you can do them separately and you can cultivate one with the other, but eventually they come together. Hasa Compania, hello. If for wisdom/insight, it's important to discern conditions of our existence with particular regard to sankharas, do we begin with being aware of how all of our impulses and experiences are driven by self-created narratives? And if so, are there such things as good sankharas? Yeah, good question. Yeah, I would say that's a perfect example actually of what the Buddha is talking about with understanding sankharas and how we create suffering. If you begin by being aware of the arising of suffering and the conditions that give rise to unwholesome actions and further suffering within this mind ground, this garden, right? We believe these narratives and then we act out of it, and then that creates this friction. More plants grow up of suffering, and then we react to them. So if we're dwelling in this state where we're being pushed and pulled and creating suffering, we have to bring awareness into that experience first. Yeah, we do start there, because if we don't slow down and develop awareness and clarity, then we're just going to keep moving and developing that momentum towards suffering. So yeah, I would say you can begin by being aware of how our impulses are driven by these self-created narratives. And the good sankharas, there are good sankharas. Good sankharas are things like, actually, a good example of this in the suttas is when the Buddha talks about the basis of success or psychic power, the iddhipadas. The definition of them has the word sankhara in it, and it's padana sankhara. So the sankhara of striving. So it's the sankhara of right effort. The effort and energy and narrative of I'm going to develop clarity and serenity and joy and peace and understanding and freedom from suffering, and I'm going to let go of the self-centered narratives. All of that actually is still a conditioned phenomenon. It's still within samsara, but it's leading us out. So those types of thought processes, those types of reactions, those types of activities and conduct that we do by body, speech, and mind in order to follow the Noble Eightfold Path, that's the good sankhara that eventually we let go of still, but we don't need to focus on letting go of it if we haven't got to a point where we haven't even let go of the bad ones, right? So we let go of the bad ones first. So it's one of the similes the Buddha gives is of a peg. If you have like a really coarse peg, you might use another peg to knock it out and replace it with a better one. And that's how we use discernment and thought processes and conditioning to let go of more coarse conditioning and develop serenity and discernment. So Manal says, can samatha be achieved while in action, or would it be counterproductive to try to achieve this? Yeah, it can be achieved in action. We should be going for samatha in all postures. So whether we're sitting, standing, walking, or lying down, or you can include into this posture, like the walking posture, you can include things like eating, even speaking. Is my mind serene? Is it caught up in this experience? Or is it only engaging in this experience because of practicality purposes? But inside, I have internally established mindfulness and awareness and stillness and non-agitation. We should constantly be watching, am I allowing the hindrances to arise? Am I allowing unwholesome qualities to arise? And if we are, am I acting out of unwholesome qualities? Because that's even worse, right? If unwholesome qualities arise, beep, 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 red light, that's the first sign of, okay, I need to be really careful here. And I need to develop samatha and vipassana. I need to develop clarity about what's going on and how this is arising. And I need to endure it and learn to not act out of it, to become peaceful despite the fact that this quality is here, right? So if we're angry, we need to learn how to not act out of the anger, not indulge in the anger, not create more anger with our mind or our body or our speech, and develop peace within the anger. And then we remove all its power and we develop more clarity about it, and it will fall away. So samatha should be achieved always. It's just the level of samatha is more the question, right? Like if you can't, especially in the beginning, while we're still someone like an arahant, it's going to be easier for them to have very profound, deep samatha because they're always unshaken by their experience. So if we're still walking the path towards that kind of state, it's going to be easier to be serene if there's less stimuli coming in and out. That's why the Buddha emphasized seclusion and quiet and things like that when we have the opportunity to do it. But that doesn't mean that it's an excuse not to develop samatha when we're out and about. And this is why, like I said in the title of the talk, this is why I call it cultivating the mind ground, not Samatha-Vipassanā meditation, right? Because the Buddha doesn't use the word meditation. He doesn't use the word for meditation. He uses words like bhavana, cultivation, which applies to all postures. And then he uses words like Samatha-Vipassanā, which are mind states and qualities we should always be developing in all postures. He uses words like samadhi, which we should always be working towards supporting and developing, even though sitting down is where it's really going to come into more fruition, because we need to disengage from other activities to unify our mind. But so we should always be cultivating these within our mind ground, within our experience. And I hope that that's shedding a little bit of light on that. PL says, 7 bojjhangas, I believe, is combination of sammasati and sammasamadhi. What are your thoughts? Yeah, the 7 bojjhangas are describing the passageway from sammasati up into sammasamadhi. So how does sammasati, supported by the other factors of the path, you could say also right view, right intention, purified bodily and verbal conduct, and right effort, all of those coming together with sammasati leading into sammasamadhi. That's what the bojjhangas are describing. So yeah, things like right view, samatha, vipassana, sati, sampajanya, right effort, all of that will need to be there, and that will lead into, as I said before, samatha, vipassana converging into right samadhi and leading into the final bojjhanga, which is this deep upekkha, this deep clarity, understanding, letting go, dispassion, and you can say equanimity towards the phenomena that appear before us. So that's a good intuition. Okay, and it looks like we are mostly done here. Hello, everybody. See lots of friends in the chat. Okay, we'll have just one more question and then we'll close up. Minnie says, does learning Dhamma by oneself, learning Dhamma by oneself good, and is it necessary to do long pujas and go to bigger gatherings? Learning Dhamma by yourself is good as long as you have guidance from someone who, ideally from the suttas, so from the Buddha and his disciples and from the compilers, the suttas are really good, and from trusted monastics who have developed these, had studied these texts and practiced and live according to them, and who all of that. So it's good to learn Dhamma by yourself, but I would say with the caveat of with the guidance of others, right? So not just by yourself, unless you're a Buddha, but with the guidance of others. But you don't need to go to a group meditation, for instance. You can practice on your own, but you just have to be guided by other people, and that can still be supportive if group meditation is not bad either. But it's not necessary. So things like that. And is it necessary to do long pujas? So pujas and big gatherings, samma puja is not on the Noble Eightfold Path. It's more of it's an activity that we do to cultivate wholesome qualities. So if you want to cultivate wholesome qualities and things like that, then yeah, but you don't need to do puja to cultivate wholesome qualities. It's just one example. Okay, everybody. I hope that this has been of use to you in your day and in your practice. I'll close with 3 sadhus and we can all go away for the morning. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. May you be happy and peaceful. May you realize Nibbana.